The old ledger smelled of dry mountain air and something else, something that had been locked away long enough to forget what the outside world felt like. Brother Tenzin Dorje set it down on the stone table with the careful movements of a man who had learned, over 67 years, that fragile things rarely announce themselves. The cover was dark, with handling along its edges, pale where no hand had touched it in decades. He opened it and found what he had been looking for: the year 1952, its entries neat and unbroken, monasteries recorded, grains counted, novices named, visiting monks catalogued. He turned the page. 1954 began without ceremony. He turned back, then forward again. 1953 was not missing. It had never been there. Not a torn edge, not a stub of glued paper, not the shadow of ink pressed through from another page. The year existed in the physical world. He had lived a portion of it himself, as a child in the valley below. But here, in the Sangchen Gompa's master record of daily life, 1953 had been removed without trace. And whoever had done it had not simply cut the pages loose. They had rebound the book. They had pressed the spine flat and reset the cover. They had made the absence look, to a casual eye, like continuity. Tenzin Dorje had not come to Sangchen Gompa to find this. He had come because the regional monastery council had asked him to, politely, which in his experience meant they had first considered asking someone younger and decided the task required too much patience. Sangchen Gompa had stood empty for 11 years. The last monk to live there, a solitary old man named Urgyen, had died alone in his cell in the autumn, and a traveling merchant found him 3 weeks later when the prayer flags above the gate had stopped moving. The council wanted an inventory of what remained. They wanted to know whether the structure was worth restoring or whether the stones should be left to the mountain. Tenzin Dorje had been living in a small room at the lower monastery, spending most of his hours reading or being asked to stop reading by younger colleagues, who found his habit of annotating borrowed texts in the margins alarming. He had accepted the assignment without much discussion. Sangchen Gompa was 8 hours by road and 3 hours on foot, high enough in the valley that the air thinned noticeably on the second hour of climbing. His knees had opinions about this. He had brought a walking staff. He had come anyway. The Gompa was smaller than he remembered. Most places were. He had passed through it once in his early 40s, accompanying his teacher on a circuit of remote monasteries that the older man had insisted on completing before his eyesight failed. They had stayed 3 nights. He remembered the cold, the quality of the silence at high altitude, and the way the head monk, a careful, watchful man whose name had drifted somewhere into the wide archive of his memory, had served them tea and asked almost no questions. Most monks in remote communities wanted news from the lower valleys. This man had seemed to want the opposite. He had seemed to be waiting for them to leave. Tenzin Dorje had not thought about that visit in many years. He thought about it now, standing over the ledger with the gap where 1953 should have been. He was not, by temperament, a suspicious man. He had learned early that most mysteries turned out to be the ordinary accumulation of small human failures. A record lost in flooding, a page damaged by rats and quietly discarded, an administrative collapse that nobody wanted to document. He set the ledger aside and began working through what the records room contained. There were 2 wooden crates pushed against the far wall, both sealed with rusted iron latches, a stack of prayer books, water-damaged along the bottom third, a rolled thanka that he unwrapped carefully and rewrapped, its painted surface intact, but its linen backing black with old moisture, a box of correspondence bundled in cloth which he set to one side, and a second ledger, identical in binding to the first, which recorded the monastery's maintenance and repair history. He opened this one with less expectation and found, without drama, that it too had been altered. Not in the same way. This time, the pages were present, but an entire section, covering construction work in the northwest corner of the compound, had been written over. The original entries had been scraped carefully with a blade. He could see the roughened paper surface when he tilted the book toward the light, and replaced with notations about routine plastering and minor roof repairs. Someone had, with considerable effort, made this monastery's records tell a different story about a specific period of time. He sat for a long moment in the stone room, listening to the wind move through the gap beneath the door. High-altitude wind has a particular quality. It does not rush or gust the way valley wind does. It presses. It finds its way into spaces and occupies them. He had once heard an older monk describe it as the sound of patience. Now, in this room with its doctored records and its careful gaps, it seemed less like patience and more like waiting. He went outside to look at the northwest corner. The exterior walls of Sangchen Gampa were constructed in the manner typical of monasteries built in this region during the 18th century. Rough stone courses set with mud mortar, finished with a lime wash that had to be renewed every few years, or it began to crack in the freeze and thaw cycle of mountain winters. The wash on most of the building was old, layered with decades of small repairs, each slightly different in color, the accumulated record of seasons and labor and gradual neglect. But on the northwest exterior, roughly 6 meters wide and running from the base to about 2 meters in height, the wash was different. Not new. It had aged, it had weathered, but more uniform, more deliberate. As though an entire section of wall had been refinished at one specific time with care, and then left alone while the rest of the building slowly fell away around it. He stood in front of it with his hands behind his back and looked at it the way he had looked at difficult passages in old texts for 4 decades, without expectation, waiting for the surface to show him what it knew. There was a seam. It was subtle, a thin vertical line in the lime wash running from approximately knee height to the top of the refinished section. Not a crack. The wall had not moved. The seam ran in too straight a line for it to be structural. It was the edge of something, a panel or a filled opening, plastered over and washed so carefully that in normal light, at a normal angle, it was invisible. He walked back inside. The northwest interior wall corresponded to the storage chamber he had already examined. He measured the exterior section with his walking staff, counting lengths, and came in and measured the interior. The mathematics were not complicated. There were approximately 2 meters of wall that did not correspond to any interior space he could access. He spent the rest of the afternoon on the correspondence box. Most of it was ordinary. Supply requests, responses from the regional council about grain allocations, a series of letters between the head monk and a trader in the valley market town negotiating the price of timber. He read each one in the thin afternoon light, setting them aside in sequence, building a picture of the mundane administrative life of a small mountain monastery in the middle decades of the 20th century. The letters ran from roughly 1948 through to 1961, with a gap. 1953. Again, not a single letter from that year. Unlike the ledger, where the binding itself told the story of deliberate removal, here the gap was simply absence. It was possible this meant nothing. It was also possible, and this was the thought that settled in him as the light failed, that the absences had been constructed, a specific year missing from the financial records. A section of wall refinished during the period that the maintenance ledger described with altered text, and not a single piece of correspondence from that year. These were not coincidences. Someone had arranged for 1953 to disappear. He found the name that night. He had returned to the maintenance ledger, examining its scraped pages more carefully in lamplight, when he noticed something near the bottom of an altered page. The scraping had not been entirely successful. In the angle of the lamp, a partial impression remained, 3 characters in Tibetan script, pressed through from the original ink, ghosting up through the surface, like something that had tried to stay hidden and could not quite manage it. He worked at it for 20 minutes, a personal name, abbreviated, and beneath it, in what appeared to be a different hand, a partial phrase. Most of it was lost. What remained when he assembled it read approximately, "Brought from the eastern path, not to be recorded among the community." He set the lamp down carefully and looked at the wall. He had encountered that administrative phrase before, "not to be recorded among the community." It had been a practice common enough in earlier decades of the century. A person received and sheltered, but not entered into the formal registers that might be inspected by outside authorities. Sometimes this protected a traveling monk whose own monastery had no record of his journey. Sometimes it was more deliberate. Sometimes it was protective of something heavier. He was tired. His knees ached from the climb and from the cold stone floor, and he was 67 years old and had not eaten enough since morning. He banked the lamp and wrapped himself in his extra blanket and lay down on the wooden sleeping platform in the nearest cell and listened to the wind press against the walls. He did not sleep easily. He lay in the dark thinking about the partial name, about the seam in the exterior wall, about the careful rebinding of the gutted ledger, and about the head monk who had served them tea 30 years ago and asked no questions and seemed to want them to leave. His teacher had said something afterward on the walk back down. He had been trying to remember what it was. By the time the first light came through the small window, he had remembered. His teacher had said, "That man carries something he was asked to carry. Do not ask him about it. It is not yours to know." He had accepted this at the time without curiosity. His teacher was given to statements that closed rather than opened. But now, lying on the wooden platform in the cold early light, he understood something he had not understood then. His teacher had known. He had passed through this monastery and looked at these walls, perhaps at this specific wall, and had said nothing, and had walked away down the mountain, and had taken the knowledge with him for the remainder of his life, and had never spoken of it. That was not a quality he had associated with his teacher, who in all other respects was a man of considerable directness. After morning prayer, performed alone in the small shrine room, its butter lamps long cold, its offering bowls empty, but its painted walls still vivid enough to feel inhabited, he went to examine the wall properly. He tapped along the refinished section of the exterior with the handle of his folding knife, moving methodically from left to right at chest height. Most of the surface returned the solid sound of packed stone and mortar. Near the right edge of the refinished section, close to the vertical seam, the sound changed, a hollow space, perhaps half a meter wide. Above and below it, the stone was solid. But here, at chest height, near the seam, the wall gave back a sound that was not quite stone. He worked along the seam, finding where the newer plaster met the older surface, teasing it loose with the knife tip. The seal had been constructed well, but decades of mountain winters had done their work on the mortar, and the plaster came away in sections without requiring force. Behind it was not wall at all, but a wooden panel, fitted into the stone course and plastered over, now revealed as old dark timber, slightly damp from decades of contact with the exterior. He worked the panel loose. It took time. His hands ached and his back protested, and twice he stopped to rest, sitting against the opposite wall with his legs extended. But the panel came free, and behind it was a recess, not a room, not quite, but a deep space cut into the thickness of the wall, perhaps half a meter across and a meter high, lined at its back with flat stones set smoothly, almost carefully. Inside the recess were three objects. The first was a cloth bundle, which he unwrapped to find a monk's robe, old, its color faded, folded with the precision of a person who had performed that task the same way every day for decades. The second was a small wooden box, its lid fitted without hinges, which opened to reveal a folded letter and two small photographs. The third object was a human skull, set with its base flat against the back wall of the recess, facing outward. He sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the letter. It was addressed to no one. It began in a hand he did not recognize. Clear, careful script. The characters formed with the deliberateness of someone who had learned to write as an adult rather than a child. I am setting down what I know because I cannot carry it further, and there is no one remaining to whom it can be given directly. The man called Phunsok Wangdu arrived here in the spring of 1953. He came on the eastern path, which means he had come over the high pass, which at that season almost no one attempts. He was ill when he arrived. He was also being sought. The letter was 4 pages, written on both sides in a hand that became less regular as it continued, as though the writer had grown tired or more distressed as the account progressed. It told, in careful and occasionally circuitous language, the story of a man sheltered at Sangchen Gampa through the spring and into the summer of 1953. Phunsok Wangdu had been a lay administrator in his earlier life, during a period of considerable political disruption in the region. He had kept records, the letter was careful here, not specifying their contents, that certain figures had wanted destroyed. He had refused. He had fled. He had arrived, half dead from the pass, at the gate of Sangchengampa, where the head monk had made a decision. He had received Phunsok Wangdu. He had not recorded him. He had housed him in the recess behind the northwest wall, concealed behind the panel that had been constructed quickly in the first days after the man's arrival. He had nursed him through his illness. When the summer came and the passes opened, 2 men arrived at the monastery asking about a traveler. The head monk told them truthfully that no traveler was recorded in his registers. They searched, found nothing, and left. Phunsok Wangdu had stayed through that autumn and through the winter. He had died in the early spring of 1954, not of his original illness, which had substantially resolved, but of a second sickness that came on quickly. He had been buried within the recess, with his robe folded and placed with him as was proper, and the panel had been reset and replastered and washed, and the records of that year had been destroyed, and the head monk had continued to live and serve at Sangchengampa for another 23 years alone, and had never spoken of it. The skull had been placed facing outward, the letter explained, so that the man would not be entirely hidden, so that anyone who opened the wall would understand that what lay here was not a shameful thing, that what lay here was a man. The letter closed. I have served this place for a long time. I do not believe I did wrong. I believe I did what was asked of me by a situation I did not choose and could not fully understand. I ask only that whoever reads this knows his name, Phunsok Wangdu. He existed. He chose not to destroy what he had witnessed. He paid a price for that. He deserves to be remembered by someone. Tenzin Dorje read the signature. He had not known the head monk's full name. He had known him only as the watchful man who had served them tea and wanted them to leave. He set the letter down and picked up the photographs. One showed a man of perhaps 40, standing in bright sunlight against a whitewashed wall, squinting slightly. He was not wearing robes. He wore the plain clothing of a lay official, his posture that of a man accustomed to standing in formal contexts. He looked like a man who had made decisions, who had weighed things and come to conclusions and lived with them. There was something in the set of his jaw, not stubbornness exactly, but related to it, the expression of someone who understood the cost of a choice and had chosen anyway. The second photograph showed 2 men together. One was the same man. The other was younger, and it took Tenzin Dorje several seconds to recognize him, because the face had been younger than he had ever known it. But the eyes were familiar, the specific watchful quality, the slightly withdrawn attention, and then it resolved, the way a difficult text finally resolves when you find the correct reading. The second man was his teacher. He set the photograph down on the stone floor and looked at it. Then he looked at the wall, then at the robe and the skull and the small wooden box. Outside, the mountain wind moved against the exterior with its slow, constant pressure. He was very cold and very still, and for a long time he did not arrange his thoughts into any particular order. He simply allowed what was present to be present. His teacher had known. He had passed through this monastery 30 years ago, and had drunk the head monk's tea, and perhaps looked at this very wall, and he had walked away down the mountain and said only, "That man carries something he was asked to carry. Do not ask him about it." Not a warning, not a deflection, a statement of fact, offered to a younger monk who had not yet understood what he was being told. He thought about what it would mean to know a thing and not speak of it. His teacher had, over the years, sometimes frustrated him with this quality, the sense that there was a large interior country to which access was limited, rooms he did not enter, walls he did not open. He understood now that this was not withholding for its own sake. His teacher had lived long enough and moved through enough difficult history to understand that some things could be carried and did not need to be set down until the right moment arrived with the right person available to receive them. His teacher had carried the knowledge of Sangchengampa for 30 years. He had died without speaking of it directly. And he had somehow, through a letter to the council perhaps, or through a remembered instruction, or through some arrangement that Tenzin Dorje might never be able to verify, ensured that his particular student would be the one sent here on the pretext of an inventory. He was not certain of this. He could not be. But he thought of the way the assignment had been framed, politely, which meant they had considered someone younger and decided the task required too much patience. And he thought that the politeness had perhaps come from a different source than he had assumed. He sat on the cold stone floor for a long time. Then he took out the small notebook he had brought for the inventory work and used it for a different purpose. He wrote down both names, Funsok Wangdu, and the head monk whose full name was now in his hands. He wrote the dates from the letter. He wrote the essential facts of what had happened in this monastery in 1953. He wrote carefully and completely, because the thing the letter requested was simple, that someone should know, that the knowledge should not end with the walls of this building. In the afternoon he walked the rest of the monastery and completed his inventory as he had been asked. He noted the condition of the roof, the state of the shrine, the contents of the remaining storage rooms. He noted that the structural walls were sound, that the flagstone courtyard was intact, that the water channel had collapsed in one section but could be repaired. He wrote all of this beside the names in the notebook. His report to the council would be straightforward. The building was salvageable. A small community could live here again if anyone wanted to. He thought they should. He thought a place that had been used for this particular act, the sheltering of a man who had refused to destroy what he had witnessed, was worth keeping in use. He did not think this was a specifically Buddhist thought. He thought it was a human one. On the morning of his departure, he performed the appropriate prayers for the dead in the shrine room. He recited both names aloud in the empty space. He stood for a moment in the northwest room before he left, looking at the open recess, the skull patient in its position, facing outward as it had been facing for more than 60 years, waiting for someone to come and complete the small act of recognition it had been left there to request. He did not replace the panel. He thought it had been closed long enough. The walk down was easier than the walk up had always been, except for his knees, which held opinions he continued to regard as legitimate but not decisive. The valley opened below him as he descended. The sky was very blue. The air thinned and then gradually thickened as he came down from altitude, and somewhere below the tree line a bird called in a pattern he recognized but could not name. He thought about his teacher. He thought about what it means to know something and carry it quietly, not out of cowardice, but out of the understanding that certain truths have a proper time and a proper recipient, and that the work of a long life sometimes consists of little more than making sure the right thing eventually reaches the right person. His teacher had believed this. He had organized a significant portion of his later years around it, without ever stating it plainly, because his teacher was that kind of man. He arrived at the lower village as evening came on, and the family who had agreed to house him made tea and set food before him, and he ate in the warm light of their fire and was grateful for the warmth and the food and the ordinary, sturdy fact of people living their lives in the valley between the mountains. They asked what the monastery had been like after so many years empty, and he told them the building was sound, that it could be restored, that it had been well used in its time. They asked what it had been used for in its years of service, and he said, for the things a monastery is for: shelter, record-keeping, the long practice of trying to understand what a situation requires of us. They seemed satisfied with this. He was too. Later, when they had gone to sleep, he sat by the diminished fire and took out the notebook and read the names again. Funsok Wangdu. The head monk who had served for 50 years and died alone and been found 3 weeks later with no one there at the end who knew what he had spent his life protecting. He wrote below the names, in his own small hand, both men chose, both men paid, both deserved to be remembered. Then he closed the notebook and sat with the dying fire and the mountain dark outside, and the specific weight of what it means to discover that the places we pass through have already been prepared for us, that the people who came before us were working toward a moment they would never witness, that the chain of small human decisions that makes a life, to shelter, to record, to remain silent for the right amount of time, to finally speak, extends in both directions further than we can see. The fire went out slowly. He did not hurry it.